Welcome guys, I am Vikram Kakar, a student of ACAS Cloud. We have seen before how to create a virtual network and then create a network security group within a virtual network. We have also created a Windows VM with a public IP and a Linux VM without a public IP in the virtual network, and both of them can communicate with each other because they are in the same virtual network. And we do that by downloading the PuTTY software on the Windows VM, and then via the PuTTY software the Windows VM can communicate with the Linux VM. Today we will see how can PCs in two different virtual networks can communicate with each other. So we have two different virtual networks. I've created two resource groups for that, East and West, and both the resource groups each contain a virtual network. Within that, a VM, Windows VM with public IP, and a Linux VM without a public IP. Within the virtual network, of course, I've created the network security group as well, which are associated to the subnets. So we have public NSG and private NSG in both the resource groups. To summarize, we will see how the PCs within both two different virtual networks can communicate with each other. So I've created the basic architecture already. Now the first thing I would do is, so I'm in the Windows VM from the East resource group. The first thing I need to do is I will go to the command prompt and I will change the firewall properties. So this is a Windows VM on the east side, and I will go to the firewall. I'll go to the advanced settings now, to the properties on the right, and I'll turn the firewall settings off. I've turned the firewall off, of course, on the Windows VM, and I'll do the same thing on the Windows VM in the west side as well, in the other virtual network. I'll first try and make both the Windows VM to communicate with each other. To enable that, I have to turn the firewall on both the Windows VM off, the firewall settings to be turned off. So I have done that now. I've done that in the Windows East. Now I'll go to the Windows VM on the west. Again, I'll go to the command prompt and get the firewall. So I'll type firewall.cpl. This is the command to enter the firewall settings. So firewall.cpl. I have the firewall settings in front of me now. On the left, I go to advanced settings. Now on the right, I go to the properties and I turn the settings off on all the three screens: domain, private, and public. So I've turned the firewall settings off on both the Windows VM, the East and the West. Now I'll try and communicate from one Windows to the other Windows VM by using their public IPs. So let's do that. I'll ping the Windows VM on the west using its public IP. So let's go to the West Windows VM. And we copy the public IP. Now I go to the command prompt on the Windows East and I type ping and the public IP of the West VM, Windows VM. We are getting a response from the West Windows VM. We turn the firewall settings off, so all that has worked. So the network is fine. We will now try and communicate from the east side Linux VM to the west Linux VM. So we are in the east Linux. Now both the Linux VMs do not have a public IP. So we will have to communicate using their private IP addresses. So let's try that. So we can see that we are not getting any response. To enable communication between PCs in two different virtual networks, we need to use a feature in Azure called pairing. So we go to any of the resource groups, any of the virtual networks. So I go to the East virtual network. On the left, there you can see this feature called pairing. I will click add. It will facilitate communication from east to west and from west to east. So I first type east to west and then I type west to east. I have the subscription here. It's asking me which virtual network I select. So because I'm in the East virtual network and I want to create a peering network, to the West virtual network. So I'll select West virtual network. And finally, I'll click add. So as you can see over here, it has successfully added two peering networks. One is the west to east, and I'll click it here. It has created two peering networks. One is the west to east, and the second is east to west. So as I said, the Linux, now we've enabled communication between the two virtual networks, and the Linux VMs do not have a public IP. So we have to communicate using their private IPs. So let's try that. So I type ping. So we can see over here 6 packets transmitted, 6 received, 0% packet loss. So we are in the Linux, East Linux. Let's try and communicate with the Windows in the West. So I would type ping. So this communication has been successful. Now let's go to the Windows VM. So I'll go to the command line. So I'm in the East Windows and I'm in the command line. Now let's try and communicate from the East Windows to the Linux in the West. As we can see, there is 0% packet loss, 4 packets sent and 4 received. Earlier, we communicated from the East Windows VM to the West Windows VM using the public IPs. Let's now communicate using the private IPs. So I will ping the West Windows using the private IP. And as we can see, again, there is 0% packet loss, 4 packets sent and 4 packets received. So today we created peering networks between two virtual networks, which are created in 2 different resource groups, and we enabled communication between PCs in these 2 different virtual networks via the feature in Azure called peering. And before we created the peering feature, we communicated from the East Windows to the West Windows, but to do that we had to turn the firewall settings off. Hope today's session is useful for you guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.